Everybody, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're in the world. I'm going to be doing a little bit of an update on the trade wars that are happening in the United States versus Canada, Mexico, particularly. I won't talk too much about China, but Canada and Mexico are the ones that are going to have the largest impact of this. Before I get into all this, as you all know, it's not financial advice. I'm not your financial advisor. You're responsible for your own trades, managing your own risk, doing your own research, and hopefully this is just one piece of education for you. Happy to get into the tariffs that are happening here in the United States. And so let's just get right into it. Okay, so we're looking at trade wars, and this is all fueled by tariffs. So let's just talk really quickly about what a tariff is. At a very, very simple, basic level, a tariff is just a tax that is placed on goods that are imported from an international source. So in this case, we're talking about the United States and Mexico importing goods into the United States and those being taxed. So what I want to focus on here is how this could be good for the United States, how this could be bad for Canada and Mexico, and how it all will kind of come together longer term, making an assumption that this does continue and does not cease. So first, I want to take a look at trade flows relative to gross domestic product. So when we take a look at Canada, Mexico, and China, what we can see is that exports to Canada from the United States have been about $250 to $300 billion a year. Imports from Canada have been about the same. Canada's overall GDP is about $2 trillion, and U.S. exports to Canada is about 15% of the Canadian GDP. On the Mexico side of things, the U.S. exports to Mexico are about $250 to $350 billion a year. Imports, again, are very similar. Mexico's overall GDP is about $1.4 trillion, and U.S. exports to Mexico is about 25% of the Mexican GDP. That is a big deal. So these are large percentages of the gross domestic product of Canada and Mexico. Now, when we take a look at China, U.S. imports from China are about $400 to $500 billion per year. And China's overall GDP is about $17 trillion. That's significant. U.S. imports from China are only about 2% of the Chinese GDP. So what does that mean? So for Canada and Mexico, this is significant. For China, the impact is pretty small. So what are these impacts that we would have we would be able to see on Canada and Mexico? Well, there are a lot of different impacts, but we can take a look at some direct effects of a 25% tariff. So, as we already mentioned, U.S. importers are now going to have to pay a 25% premium or a tax, a tariff, on all imported goods. And in this case, we're talking about from Canada and from Mexico. So a $50,000 car imported from Canada is now going to really cost about $62,500. $12,500 of that is a tax that goes to the federal government. And again, typically those costs are going to be passed to the consumer. So that means that U.S. citizens are more than likely going to have to pay that additional cost, but it's going to be passed as a net value. So instead of that car costing you $50,000, it's now more than likely going to cost you $62,500. The person that is selling you that good is not just going to eat that cost. They have to pass it to somebody, and it's going to get passed to the consumer. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a little bit. So from a translation perspective, from Canada, U.S. exports are 15% of Canadian GDP. That means when I say U.S. exports, I mean Canada exporting goods to the United States are about 15% of the Canadian economy. And if exports drop, say, 20%, that would be a 3% drop in Canadian GDP. It's kind of a big deal. And if we were talking about Mexico, right, U.S. exports from Mexico to the United States are about 25% of Mexican GDP. So if exports out of Mexico into the United States drop 20%, that's about a 5% drop in Mexican GDP. That is also a big, big deal. I'm not here to say that we're going to turn Canada and Mexico into third world countries, but I will say that that is a significant impact on the gross domestic product of Canada and Mexico. So what are some threats here? So U.S. citizens are likely going to have a paradigm shift in their spending patterns, and they are not going to be buying goods from an international source. They're going to be looking for goods that are manufactured domestically because the cost of them is going to be significantly cheaper, because goods that are manufactured in the United States are not going to have to pay that really high tariff as they're imported into the United States. So that's going to be potentially a reduction on dependency on foreign imports. And if you think about that, that can cause a little bit of a cascading domino effect. And you can likely see that there is going to be a little bit of a trend as we get into this. So those were some of the direct effects. Let's talk about some of the indirect effects of these tariffs. So what can we potentially see as an indirect effect? Well, we can see supply chain disruptions. We can see some investment and employment opportunities in the United States. You can see a policy response, which we are already seeing in some cases, and you can see retaliation. So when we talk about supply chain disruptions, a lot of industries do rely on cross-border supply chains. The automotive industry is a big one that does rely on cross-border supply chains. So higher tariffs can impact and disrupt those supply chains, which can, of course, as I already mentioned, increase the costs and potential losses in efficiency. A drop in export demand, like for instance in Canada and in Mexico, a drop in export demand could affect production decisions, and that could potentially impact employment and investment opportunities internationally. But more than likely, what it will do is it will increase employment and investment opportunities in the United States, which is where a lot of these countries rely on to export goods into. From a policy response standpoint, so the impacted countries, in this case Canada and Mexico, may respond with their own trade measures. That's going to complicate the picture, because now you've got, two different countries that are, basically applying tariffs on goods that are coming and going from those countries. But what you really need to take a look at is that country's ability to make that leverage and keep that leverage. Because fact of the matter is, we were talking about the GDP ratios and what would happen if there was a contraction on imports into the United States out of those countries. They're going to see a contraction of their GDP, which is not going to be very good longer term for them. They're going to need to find a way to supplement that. And of course, you have retaliation. You already have countries that are making these policy responses that are going to be seen as a retaliatory measure against the United States for imposing their own tariffs. So what about some caveats? What kind of caveats do we have here? So some things that we need to look at is, if you are an importer, how sensitive are you to price increases? Some may be more sensitive than other industries. How easy can suppliers find alternative markets? And of course, some sectors are highly integrated. Automobile industry is very highly integrated. The agriculture industry is highly integrated. So we are going to be looking at those. One thing that you're likely going to see, I'm just going to give a great example, is Florida orange juice. The only place you can get Florida orange juice is Florida in the United States of America. So chances are pretty good, if Canada puts a tariff on goods coming from the United States, you may see the cost of orange juice in Canada increase. So what is that going to do? If you are a Canadian and you are going to the store and buying orange juice, you may not buy Tropicana orange juice, whatever brand it is that is creating that Florida orange juice. It's likely going to cost more. So naturally, you're going to choose the cheaper alternative, because orange juice is orange juice. Some have just a slightly better flavor than others. Everybody has their own personal preference, but orange juice is orange juice. If it's going to cost you $1 more per gallon, you're going to go with the cheaper alternative. And the same thing is true in the United States. There are so many alternatives. So what you're basically looking at here is a paradigm shift in spending patterns, and you are likely going to see increased investment in United States-based companies, and that is the goal here. The goal is to increase investment in the United States from a manufacturing perspective, from a production perspective, from a sales and marketing perspective. You're going to start to see, assuming that these tariffs do what they are designed to do, and we start to see things actually kind of develop. Those are the kinds of things that we're going to see. This is not a bad thing for the United States. Of course, it's going to have negative consequences internationally when we're talking about Canada and Mexico, but in the United States, this is a good thing, but it takes time. So again, we go into this. How is this good? How is this good for the United States? Okay, well, of course, we're going to see higher prices, right? From an immediate impact perspective, when these tariffs kick in, unless there's a stockpile of goods that have already been imported, that are already on the shelves, unless you see stores taking advantage of the situation, you're not going to immediately see the cost go up, but you will see the international goods start to cost more. That is expected. Consumers are either going to pay the higher prices or they're going to find alternatives. I gave a really great example about Florida orange juice, right? If you're looking at different different products that are, maybe the brand is different, but the product is the same, you're going to go with the cheaper alternative. Unless you are just going to die on that cross that you are going to buy Florida orange juice from Alberta, Canada, you're going to look for the cheaper alternative. And I think humans already do that to a certain extent. You're going to start to see supply chain shifts. US-based companies are going to start to look for domestic alternatives to reduce cost. Now, you certainly will not be able to do that all across the board, but wherever you have the opportunity to produce something domestically to reduce the cost, you're going to do that. Any normal, level-headed businessman or businesswoman is going to do that, which will increase the investment in domestic production. From a product availability standpoint, you may see the variety of goods decrease. So I'm going to use liquor as an example. Here in the United States, we love our Crown, right? Whiskey. And if there are increased tariffs on goods coming into the United States from Canada, well, that Crown's going to cost you about 25% more. So if that was a $20 bottle of Crown that you were buying yesterday, tomorrow it might be $25. So what are you going to look for? You're going to look for different alternatives. You might get Jack Daniels instead of Crown from a whiskey standpoint. Certainly the flavors are different, but you get the idea. There are going to be lots of opportunities. Consumers may also find additional domestic options introduced. Now, again, this goes back to what I was saying before about this takes time. It takes time for all of these things to go into, take an impact. So there could be some longer term impacts that can be seen in the time horizon if you go out. It could be months, could be years. But some long-term benefits. Inside of the United States, job creation, because local production will encourage investment domestically. Production expansion will create jobs domestically. We can see an increase in jobs, an increase in wages, increase in domestic demand, and you're going to start to see less and less of companies sending jobs overseas. Now that's something that nobody has really talked about yet. How many of you, put a comment in the video below, how many of you work in an industry where jobs have been outsourced, where jobs have been sent across borders? There is nothing wrong with that, but you see it more and more, and what these tariffs are designed to do is to try and bring some of that back. Certainly isn't going to bring everything back, but from a production standpoint, it's designed to bring that back. Creating a domestic dependency and strengthening domestic supply chains. Reducing dependency on imports will improve national security because we're going to have less of a dependency on foreign land. We are going to be dependent upon ourselves more and other countries less. It'll increase innovation. U.S. companies likely will invest in new technologies from a supply chain standpoint, manufacturing standpoint, and over time all of these investments are going to lead to higher productivity and just an increase in jobs that we have here in the United States. And this will also create some negotiating leverage. And again, this is more of a long-term deal. But if we can decrease our trade deficit, this is great for negotiating leverage because we have less of a dependency on foreign products, foreign goods. The US government may have more leverage in future trade negotiations, which is also very, very important, and will be able to secure favorable agreements that benefit the United States' economic interests. I think we can all agree that the United States is in debt up to our eyeballs. We are on the verge of financial collapse. And, really the whole world is, to be honest. But our interest payments are through the roof. We need to find a way to bring jobs back into the United States. We need to find a way to increase wages in the United States. We need to find a way to just increase our economy and strengthen that domestically. And this is one way to do that. Whatever has been happening over the last 20, 30 years hasn't been working. So we need to find a way to just kick that into gear, and that's what this is designed to do. So a 25% tariff on imports from Canada or Mexico could and likely will lead to higher prices for certain goods in the short term, which likely could dampen consumer spending. It could be seen as inflationary. It will also lead to a reorientation of supply chains, increased domestic production, which can and likely will lead to job creation and improved industrial competitiveness over time. An enhanced national resilience by reducing your dependency on foreign goods that are imported and to encourage local sourcing. Encourage sourcing from a domestic source instead of a foreign source, and leading to long-term innovation and potential improvements in the trade balance to reduce our trade deficit and to equalize things and get things to a point where we are bringing more jobs back into the United States. All right, guys, that's what I've got for you right now. If this video did help you, feel free to like and subscribe and all of that good stuff. And again, if you have any comments or any anything that you want to mention about the tariffs, feel free to put those in the comments below. They can be seen as a good thing. They can be seen as a bad thing. I totally understand the negatives here, but if you take a look at the long term and you're not short-sighted, I think you can see the benefits that this can have. Tariffs on goods coming into the United States from Canada or from Mexico will increase the cost of those goods. But what it will also do is it will improve the domestic dependency that we have here in the United States. Everybody's going to look at their shirt and they're going to see that it was not produced here in the United States. But by these tariffs increasing the dependency on domestic sources, you are potentially going to start to see a shift on that. And you're going to start to see more goods being manufactured and being produced here in the United States. And that, in my opinion, is not a bad thing. There could be a little bit of pain, but overall, you're not going to see a huge change in your day-to-day. That's all I've got for you. And wherever you're in the world, have a great day, a great night, and a great evening. Take care.